I would like to mention some other influences on the study of cognition that appear to at least partially defy the idea of behaviorism. For instance, Gestalt psychology. And by the way, it's pronounced with an SH. It's German. So the suggestion of Gestalts is that we have a tendency to see wholes, WHOLES. This holistic tendency is powerful and automatic. For example, if I take it to this next slide, and I got this from the interwebs, here's some examples of Gestalt laws. So for instance, as on the top left, I group by red and green. Can't help it. If things are similar, I put them together. Nobody instructed me to do that, but I just do it. I tend to see with the Olympic rings there that the circles continue through each other or on top of each other. What I don't see is X amount of incomplete macaroni segments, if you will. I just can't help but see the holes. On the top right, I see two groups of dots, two groups of 3 columns of dots. I just can't help that. But just because they're near each other, I tend to group them. And these are things that weren't reinforced. I just have this overwhelming tendency to do those things independently. Continuity, on the bottom left, I tend to see a snake-like shape. Now, in the middle bottom, strictly speaking, there are 4 segments there, but I tend to see a whole diamond. It looks like a baseball diamond from an aerial perspective. I just can't help but close it, given the suggestion that it's there. And then I tend to group the dots in the 2 circles on the bottom right. But the ultimate point of this is, not the particulars, is that you see things this way because of automatic tendencies to see holes and to group things. And we're not reinforced for it. So it sort of complicates a behaviorist narrative that we've ever been reinforced for this, that we only do things that we're reinforced to do. That Skinner wouldn't have endorsed this. Also influences study of individual differences. Galton, who, by the way, is the first cousin of Charles Darwin, kind of interesting. Imagine how proud their grandparents were. Our 2 grandsons were out there setting the world on fire, but he was the first to develop the idea of a correlation. And although it was rather informally rendered as he did it, not quite mathematically astute. But for instance, twin studies looking at IQ similarities are a natural consequence of this sort of endeavor. The highest value, by the way, you probably remember this, but the highest value for a correlation is 1. Now, as you look at these twins, and this isn't in the book, but I just wanted to provide an example. You've got, let's take just the top 2 rows. Identical twins raised together, which most often happens. Their IQ, their intelligence quotient, is heavily correlated, 0.86, as you might expect, like the Olsen twins. But in the rare case in which they're raised apart, it's a little bit lower. And there's an organization in Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota, that literally, as part of its research aim, and they're funded through $1 million grants, is to find twins that were raised apart for obscure reasons. And they found plenty and conducted these studies. And you can go through here and look at all sorts of relations. So, for example, fraternal twins raised together have a lower correlation than identical twins raised together, as you might expect. That genetic component is not there as the same. So, anywho, there's individual differences can be a controversial study, but in this case, it's pretty benign looking at twins or rates of schizophrenia. The correlational studies have told us a lot. That's very reassuring about rates of schizophrenia. Even if, for example, one's twin has schizophrenia, there's only a 50% chance that they'll have it. And if your sibling has it, it's even much lower. And if your first cousin has schizophrenia, your chances are still quite remote. So those are very reassuring stats. Now, what about this cognitive revolution? Well, there was a period during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s where Skinner's viewpoint tended to dominate. He was a powerful intellectual, very good speaker, had a lot of acolytes, But interestingly, I'm going to throw this in as trivia. He did not begin at Harvard until he was 54. He had worked in Minnesota and 1 year in Indiana, not in obscurity, doing great work, but he did not spend his whole life at Harvard. He didn't even start till age 54, kind of interesting. But his influence was great. But this cognitive revolution was a sentiment that suggested we do believe that there are mental processes that are not reinforced and that are unique and powerful and are sometimes almost unexplainable, and you have to dig a little harder to figure out why they happen. For example, a cognitive revolution in the 1950s rejected those assumptions that thought did not exist outside reinforcement. For instance, why did pilots, of course, are reinforced to be safe, why did they sometimes crash? So if you'll indulge, I want to read this paragraph. A type of plane often crashed while landing. It turned out that the lever that the pilot had to use for braking was near the lever that retracted the landing gear, and during landing, the pilot could not take his or her eyes off the runway, but by then it was all his. So the pilot had to work by touch alone. Sometimes pilots retracted the landing gear instead of putting on the brakes. They touched the ground with the belly of the plane at top speed, which would be bad. The best way to keep them from crashing was not to exhort them to be careful. They were already motivated to avoid crashing, for Pete's sake. So improving training procedures was also an inefficient approach. Pilots with many safe landings behind them committed this error, as well as rookies. So the most reasonable approach was to redesign the craft's controls so that completely different arm movements were required for braking and retracting the landing gear, of course. So this led to a subdivision of cognitive psychology, human factors engineering. And human factors engineers attempted to answer thorny questions not answerable by behaviorism. For instance, we have limited capacity to absorb information and use it. So, for instance, how many consecutive numbers can you recall? Well, there's a psychologist named Miller that discerned that it's very few, maybe 7 plus or minus 2, maybe as few as 5 and as many as 9. So among the things that we've learned is that we're overtaxed easily. It's very difficult to recall a lot of information at once. Another influence is the idea of linguists. And by the way, I like to mention people that live a long time in the field of psychology, and there are a lot. Chomsky is about 94, I want to say, Noam Chomsky. You may know him as sort of a anti-war pundit, probably pretty left-leaning, does not like President Trump or any right-leaning people. He's, everybody's got their opinions, and that's his stick these days. But in the 50s, he became very well known as a linguist, and he showed that toddlers adapt language quickly, and that cannot be explained by reinforcement. For instance, a toddler, adorable, cute as a button, will say things like sheeps or eated because they've overgeneralized. Generally speaking, plurals end in S or ES, like churches. And it's rare that you have something that doesn't end in S or ES. But they've shown learning. Now, later the exceptions will come, but their sophistication is clear from a pretty early age, which is kind of cool. So Noam Chomsky, very influential, and I'll tell you the story one day if I ever see you. You can interrupt me at Walmart or whatever, but he actually picked a significant fight with B.F. Skinner in reviewing one of his books. And he was very young back then. I guess he was about 30 in 1960, and by that time Skinner was already very established in his mid-50s, and you could argue that Chomsky kind of won and made the case that behaviorism was oversimplified with respect to learning language, because you could say no toddler has ever been reinforced for saying sheeps or eated, but they reflexively produce these things based on learning those generalizations of language.